Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Folks like Tucker Carlson were saying that I had the power, me, Nina Jankowicz, had the power to send men with guns to the homes of Americans with whom I disagreed, that I was going to be chief censor of the United States. And nothing could have been farther from the truth. And it resulted in tens of thousands of vitriolic messages sent to me, some credible threats. I was pregnant at the time. I was just a couple weeks away from becoming a mom. And, you know, the way I describe it in one sentence is that it's changed the way that I move around in the world.
Hi, I'm Arthur Snell, and this is Disorder, the podcast that tries to find order in our mad world. This week, Jason is away, so I'm going to be hosting this episode. And I'm very excited to share some news with all of you. The Disorder podcast is now in partnership with RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. I'm sure all listeners are familiar with this well-established, prestigious think tank in London. Jason Pack and I have become associate fellows of the institution. So as part of this partnership, there'll be live events. And the first of those live events is going to be on the 11th of March. And the best way to stay abreast of that is to subscribe to our Substack, and you'll get all the information as it emerges. And I'm very excited, and it's a huge privilege actually, to have as our guest this week, Nina Jankowicz. Nina's somebody whose work I have been following for some time. She is an expert in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Ukraine. And the first part of her career was really focused on that part of the world. But in the early 2020s, she became better known as an expert on disinformation. In 2022, she was appointed by the Biden administration to something that was going to be called the Disinformation Governance Board, which was part of the United States Department of Homeland Security. The job was effectively a coordination role to draw together different parts of what the US government was doing to counteract disinformation. But Nina herself became a huge target, particularly for people on the right of American politics. Fox News became obsessed with this appointment, and as she will go on to explain in our interview, very quickly her life became literally quite dangerous. And eventually the Biden administration basically backed down. They abandoned her and the post was pulled. So since then, she has worked in various NGOs and in other foundations, and her current work is involved with something called American Sunlight, which tries to counteract disinformation by providing clear information and research to Americans. Nina, welcome to the Disorder podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Well, Nina, it's great to be talking to you, and great to be talking to you again, because I was lucky enough to interview you a couple of years back when, in fact, I think your stint in US government had only recently come to an end. So I think we better start there, actually. During the Biden presidency, you were appointed to an important role to look at disinformation, and yet that did not come off as planned. Perhaps you could give the story briefly to listeners who aren't familiar with it, and then we could talk about why and what it tells us about the world we're in today.
Absolutely. So in 2022, I was appointed to lead a body at the Department of Homeland Security called the Disinformation Governance Board. This board was meant to coordinate what DHS, which is a massive kind of Frankenstein of a government agency, was doing in response to disinformation. You know, you had like the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, which was dealing with election infrastructure and disinformation surrounding that. You had Customs and Border Protection dealing with rumors about how you could seek asylum in the United States that were driving large amounts of irregular migration. The list goes on and on. And the idea was to bring all those folks together and make sure that they were, you know, marching to the beat of the same drummer, make sure that what the department was doing was respecting civil rights, civil liberties, privacy of American citizens, and also just create policy at a higher level for how all that work got done within the department. When the initiative was announced, unfortunately, it was announced in a very opaque way. And the other side, critics of the Biden administration and I don't want to say just folks on the right, because there are actually a lot of folks on the far left of the spectrum. We've all heard about horseshoe theory, right? Believe me, it's very real. They all started to criticize the effort as a ministry of truth. They had no evidence for this. It was mere allegations. But the way the internet works, within 24 hours, Fox News was talking about this as if it were fact. And folks like Tucker Carlson were saying that I had the power, me, Nina Jankowicz, had the power to send men with guns to the homes of Americans with whom I disagreed, that I was going to be chief censor of the United States. And nothing could have been farther from the truth. In my work defending freedom of expression in places like Russia and Ukraine, I've come out against censorship, right?
Yeah.
This is something that's pretty core to the way I approach this work. And the department just couldn't figure out a way to respond. So the rumors became more and more real to people who were hearing them over and over and over for weeks on end. And it resulted in massive threats against me and my family, tens of thousands of vitriolic messages sent to me, some credible threats. I was pregnant at the time. I was just a couple weeks away from becoming a mom.
Wow.
And my family was threatened. Later on, long after I left the department, I had to get a protective order against a cyber stalker that I have. I've been named in frivolous lawsuits. You know, the way I describe it in one sentence is that it's changed the way that I move around in the world. We are looking over our shoulder at all times, even if we kind of get used to it. The idea that somebody could show up outside my door when I'm, bringing my son home from daycare and live stream us or worse, it's something that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. So for the past 3 years, nearly 3 years, I've been speaking out about my experience because I left not just because of the Biden administration's response, but because of this crazy pressure to try to protect my family. And it really has not stopped.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many elements of that story which are just awful. And obviously, personally, I'm very sorry you've had to go through this as somebody who, you're a private citizen. Yes, you have a role in public policy, but to have to be put in that situation is terrible. But one thing that strikes me as a horrible irony is that obviously your work is about challenging and confronting disinformation. And yet the biggest thing that happened to you was a huge disinformation campaign waged against you by Fox News, but as you say, people on the hard left and so on. So I suppose one question is, do you think that there was some organizing element to this?
I've certainly seen a couple of friends who do network analysis who have pulled kind of the way that the narrative spread and flourished. While I think certainly the right in America is quite organized in its messaging, they have a lot of message discipline. A lot of the things that we were seeing happening, being said about me on Twitter were repeated then by members of Congress. And it seemed like those talking points were getting shared around. But I do maintain that without the match lit by Fox News in particular, which is the largest cable news network in the world, it wouldn't have gotten quite so bad. I've dealt with online abuse before. In fact, I wrote a book about it.
Yeah.
When you are piping these vitriolic lies into the homes of over 100 million Americans, and you're repeating them over and over and over. My face and my name were in 70% of Fox News broadcasts on the hour, every hour, for the first couple of weeks after the announcement of the board. You become public enemy number one. And the consequences for that are, as a private security consultant that I hired told me, he was very against me going out by myself ever. I had talked to him while I was driving to a friend's house, and he said, Nina, you shouldn't be on your own right now. You shouldn't be in your car. Do not get gas. Do not get coffee on your own. If you do need to go out, because I was like, I have to go to prenatal appointments every week now. I'm about to give birth. He was like, well, try to disguise yourself as much as possible because your face is everywhere and they know that you're pregnant, right?
Yeah.
And so it just becomes very scary. And that element, that accelerant that Fox News played, then, which of course is amplified by social media, they share everything on social, it becomes really out of control really quickly.
Obviously, the name of this podcast is the Disorder Podcast, and clearly Fox News, in this case, played a disordering role. But of course, we know that they've done it in many other cases, but notably, perhaps most notably, in sharing and magnifying the big lie, which, that Donald Trump was cheated out of the 2020 election, and for which we know that they had to pay a lot of compensation to election machine manufacturers. So if we talk a bit about Fox and the sort of ecosystem that it operates in, what is it that you understand to be their objective in not just your story, but in the wider promotion of this kind of disorderly disinformation?
Sure. Well, I think Fox benefits from disorder 100%. So when we see them amplifying things like President Trump and J.D. Vance's claims that immigrants in Springfield during the election were eating dogs and cats, when we see them amplifying the election rumors, when we see them making, at the time, a 33-year-old woman who was pregnant into public enemy number one for no reason, but it is profitable for them. And if you look at the reporting done in particular by folks like Brian Stelter, who has a great book called Network of Lies, which is all about the Dominion case, they make those editorial choices very deliberately. And so when I look and see, okay, they tested this message out with me and then they began to repeat it over and over, it's because they got good feedback from their viewers. People were engaged. People love to hate. And so when we look at where we're headed in the next couple of weeks and years here in the United States with Trump's second presidency just beginning, I think we have not only Fox, but a whole network of disorderers who are engaging in this sort of behavior, often, in my opinion, knowingly. They know that these things are false, but it is beneficial to them, either in terms of profit or in terms of power. And we're seeing that really playing out with the tech sector as well, not just with Elon Musk, but recently Meta's announcements that they're rolling back fact-checking, that they're not going to be, moderating hate speech on the platform. And then just recently, and perhaps more worryingly, all the AI moderation that they were doing to slow the accelerant on harmful rumors and disinformation in election seasons and things like that, those have been fully reversed now, according to reporting by Casey Newton at Platformer. And this, again, is a play for profit, right? Zuckerberg wants to make sure he's not regulated out of existence. He wants to keep making money. And so he's made a calculation that cozying up to Trump is the best way to do that.
Obviously, if we think back to that 2020 experience in comparison with the most recent presidential election, yes, there was loads of online disinformation, but there was also the big platforms seemed to be at least making an effort to limit it. So Trump was kicked off Twitter, he was kicked off Facebook, there were various stories were pulled and so on. Whereas now, as you say, that the big tech sector has sort of crawled right in with Trump. Is this just very simply about profit? Is it simply an economic decision? Or is there something with Elon Musk? It seems to be there's something even more sort of cultural and visceral for him about where he's ended up politically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Musk in particular has not just thrown his chips in behind Trump, he has supported him to the tune of, $250 million during the election. Him buying Twitter was a political move as well, as much as he liked to claim it wasn't. With Zuckerberg, it's a little hard to say. He's kept his cards closer to his chest, but for a long time, I've watched the way that Mark Zuckerberg has cozied up to autocrats, disorderers around the world, right? That's not just President Trump, but it's also folks like Narendra Modi in India. It is people like Putin in some cases. I was looking back at some old writing that I did in 2018, and there was a time when Facebook and Instagram were censoring content that Alexei Navalny was putting out that was critical of the Putin regime because they didn't want to risk getting their platforms banned in countries like India or Russia. Turkey is another great example. After the coup in 2016, there was a ton of censorship happening there. And so Mark Zuckerberg can talk this talk all he wants about fighting for freedom of expression, but in the past, when given the chance of standing up for free expression, he has crumpled. And so I think what we're seeing here is just a repeat of that behavior. Now, maybe in his heart of hearts, he does want to stand up for free expression, but free expression doesn't ever seem to trump his profits. And so I think it's a mix of both with him. But I think we have to just be really clear that he sees this as an opportunity to disinvest in things that were costing him a lot of money and causing him a lot of grief. And now we have this race to the bottom between Zuckerberg and Musk and active participation in what my friend Julie Pizzetti calls the broligarchy, which I think is brilliant, right? And that's what the United States is going to be over the next couple of years. And hopefully there are folks who are going to push back against what I see as corruption.
One of the things that is so frustrating about your case is that obviously the government backed down. This wasn't like you were some sort of plucky independent NGO. This was a position which ultimately I mean, I'm not trying to relitigate the choices it made, but it didn't feel able to stand up to this pressure. But what I was thinking about is the actual election campaign that's unfolded, the degree to which you think disinformation was important in shaping the campaign. Now, in past campaigns, there's been a lot of talk about foreign interference, but one wonders whether in this campaign the interference was domestic and was actually from the likes of Musk's Twitter platform and other sort of unregulated or little regulated, disorderly players in the system.
So my initial reaction in the day after the election result was known was that I didn't think that disinformation won the election necessarily. This has become such a part of the fabric of our daily lives. And what I heard a lot, both in news reporting and conversations with Trump voters, was that, they know he lies, but they like what he was offering. And that's not just with economics. I think there's this argument that you want somebody brash, you want somebody bold to represent America. And the choice of candidates that Americans were afforded this time around, even though, I'm personally a huge fan of Kamala Harris, and I think she's an inspiration for a lot of people, that just wasn't the case. And so when given that choice, some people either voted for Trump or stayed home. A lot of Democrats stayed home this time around, which I think is part of it. But for Trump voters, I think they chose disinformation. They recognize it and not necessarily like it, but it's just something that, for them does not cut at the root of our democracy the way that I have seen it do in many other countries. And I'm worried that the foundation that we're built on now is very shaky indeed.
I mean, one area where my sense as an outsider observing America, it feels that disinformation has made a big impact. And it might be one that resonates with you, and given your work in Ukraine, is on attitudes on the American right to supporting Ukraine. So there's now this kind of, it's taken for granted that money that's sent to Ukraine is spent corruptly and it's being turned into, Swiss bank accounts or whatever. Interestingly, there's one story which I don't know if it crossed your radar, but it's personal to me, in that I live in the area where our king has his kind of holiday home. And it was alleged that Zelensky had bought it off him because he'd made so much money from, the Americans that he's now bought. There was even apparently a TV crew went to interview the locals to ask whether they were annoyed about Zelensky buying this sort of castle off King Charles, which the whole story, was nonsense. But just as a sort of illustration of how this has taken root in some elements of the culture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually did some research when I was still with the UK-based nonprofit, the Center for Information Resilience, back in, I suppose it was 2023, that we released a report looking at the early kind of seeds of Ukraine fatigue, as we were calling it. Yeah. And at the time, you saw mostly it was the frontline nations who were hosting a lot of Ukrainian refugees where this sentiment was most visible, and it was starting to percolate in the United States. By the time we published that report, the research had been done in late 2022. A report came out in early 2023. For the 1-year anniversary of the war, we saw Matt Gaetz introducing a bill to stop all aid to Ukraine, and things have only gotten worse since then. This is another one of those easy to build up profitable stories for people because, any American who is buying groceries or getting gas recognizes that there is more economic pressure, that inflation is not quite out of control, but it is creating real effects on our wallets. And so it's an easy win for politicians who want to say, oh, yeah, the reason that your eggs cost more and gas is more expensive is because we're sending billions of dollars of aid to Ukraine. And of course, the two things, with the exception of the price of wheat, which, you can firmly blame on Putin and some relationship to oil as well as they shut off gas. I mean, again, let's blame it on Putin. Let's not blame it on Ukraine. Let's blame it on the man who caused the war, not the nation that's trying to defend itself. The other thing is that most Americans have no idea how foreign aid works. The reality is that, especially for military aid that we're giving to Ukraine, that's creating American jobs and pumping money into the American economy. We're making those weapons here and et cetera, et cetera. So your listeners know this, of course, but it's an easy story to tell. And it's a winning narrative, not only for the Republicans, but for some of the folks that are feeding that information to them, like Russia. And we saw that in the court cases and indictments that came out in the fall, that actually a lot of those narratives had been seeded by Russian trolls and then picked up in the halls of Congress, because not even our members of Congress have the information literacy it takes to discern fact from fiction with this stuff, because everything is politics. It's just too important for them to score those political points.
You touched on the case, which I think it was an FBI indictment, which laid out in some detail the way that Russia was paying kind of online influencers, right-wing influencers during the election campaign. And as you say, those messages percolated through into the mainstream. For anyone, I grew up in the 80s, so the idea the Republican Party would become a pro-Russia party is still something I have to
I know.
sort of pinch myself. It's real. But do you think that it seems that voters don't seem to mind? It seems that it hasn't been an electoral cost. Why do you think that is?
I think there have been shifts in the foreign policy landscape. Even, when I first started my career in Washington, we had hawks like Marco Rubio, soon to be Secretary of State.
Right.
We had folks like Mitt Romney, who were quite anti-Russia. Romney famously so, who claimed that Russia was the greatest strategic threat to the United States in the 2012 election. And Obama said that he was crazy for doing so.
Yeah.
It's just changed. And I think part of that is the creeping right of the Republican Party, the kind of redefining of conservatism to mean something more traditionally, culturally, socially conservative. And I think the alignments that we see between Russia and particularly the far right, some of which Russia is cultivating itself, is kind of scary. Americans who see a strong leader in Vladimir Putin and wish that America would be closer with him, wish that we would have the sorts of racist, homophobic, and misogynistic policies that are enshrined in Russia, where perhaps your listeners know domestic abuse is basically decriminalized in Russia. That's the sort of thing that people who are on the far right look over there and see and say, I think America should be more like that. And that's what is really worrisome. And, when you have a leader like Trump who is so transactional, so easily flattered, and he really bases all of his interactions with world leaders on these very personal relationships, you can see how Putin could really flatter his way into an outcome in Ukraine that would be good for Russia, flatter his way into who knows what with Trump in terms of trade deals or state secrets and all of these things. I really don't think, Trump has said openly, I don't think a good relationship with Russia would be such a bad thing. And, that is just so anathema to the ideals that we hold near and dear. So it's partially this cultural shift and the magnification of the Republican Party.
I want to talk a bit about the picture here in Europe, and I know you've worked a lot here and you follow events here. Obviously, Germany is coming up to general elections. There seems to be quite a sort of active role being played by disinformation there, but also actually here in the UK and Elon Musk as an individual promoter and sharer of disinformation plays an increasingly significant role in politics in this country on the hard right. And there's this whole, argument around the role of certain communities that might or might not be, involved in kind of sex trafficking, that kind of thing. Do you think, is this about one or two ultra powerful individuals and their kind of personal obsessions, or is there something wider going on here in terms of that kind of disinformation surge that appears to be happening here in Europe around our politics?
There's a couple of things at play. Musk in particular has really bristled at the idea of regulation. And so I think there is a personal hope that by supporting the hard right in the UK, AfD in Germany, far-right figures in Australia as well, that Musk might escape some of the toothier regulation that has been passed that could bring social media platforms like X to heel. I looked in particular, I brought up Australia because I did some research on the way that he went toe-to-toe with Julie Inman-Grant, the e-safety commissioner of Australia, she has the responsibility of protecting not only children online against child sexual abuse material and other stuff, but protecting all Australians from harmful online content, including terrorist content. And in the spring, she asked Musk to remove a video of a stabbing of a priest that had taken place just outside of Sydney. And he refused, even though that content likely went against X's policies and was prohibited by Australian law. He refused to do that. She had to take him to court. He hired very expensive lawyers. And in the meantime, sicked a wave of abuse on her that has totally changed her life. And I've interviewed her about that. And she eventually had to back down because they have other cases that they're bringing against X and other social media platforms. But it shows the degree to which not only is he willing to meddle in the internal politics, but to individually target people who are just doing their jobs.
Now, there is, of course, a common factor when you talk about a lot of these people that Musk has targeted. They're women. And a lot of your work, very understandably, but also very importantly, has focused on the way that women are specifically targeted and objectified online.
Yeah.
I think you recently looked at this thing of people using deep fake porn to attack public figures. Perhaps you could say a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So as long as deepfakes have been around, they have been primarily used to create non-consensual intimate imagery is the technical term. We'd call it deepfake pornography or deepfake sexual abuse. And that's really what it is. With just one photograph of someone and usually $0, there are kind of pay-to-play apps as well, you can create lifelike, photorealistic images and videos of someone in a sexual situation that they never consented to and never participated in. And those videos are then replicated across the internet and they cause enormous harm. This was something I was interested in before it happened to me. Unfortunately, it was something that I dealt with as well in the wake of my debacle with DHS, but it's in particular used by anti-democratic nations, disorderers like Russia, to undermine female democratic activists around the world. It's kind of the compromat that we used to see in the Soviet era, except you don't actually have to get the compromat now.
You don't. You have to organize the act. It just happens.
Exactly. And they're also just used to shame ordinary women, soccer moms, high school students. We're seeing these things happening to middle school and high school girls as well around the world. And there are very, very few regulations on the books that prohibit it. The UK, I know, is considering laws about criminalizing deepfake porn. We also had one on the books here in the United States that almost got through at the end of the last legislative session, but then Musk and Trump tanked the bill known as the continuing resolution, which is a spending package that often things that didn't make their way through committee kind of get tacked on at the last second. And they tanked the whole thing, which was a real loss for American women because we just did some research that identified that 1 in 6 women serving in Congress are the victims of deepfake pornography. We identified tens of thousands of these videos targeting these women. And the idea, again, is to denigrate us, is to make us think twice before we speak out publicly. We only found one man in all of the hundreds of men who are serving in Congress. One man was targeted with deepfake pornography. So 1 in 330-something men, 1 in 6 women who serve in Congress. It's just shocking. And again, I'll just note that most of the people who are affected by this, yes, there are a lot of celebrities, but there are also ordinary people who have angry exes or who just, made somebody mad at the grocery store once. And now they have this replicating itself across the internet and very little pathway to justice when they find out about it.
And do you see it as the objective to drive women out of the public sphere, basically? Because obviously that's what people have tried to do with you, because perhaps women are a threat to a certain strand of political action? Or is it that targeted, or is it something more about, as you were saying earlier, it's more about allowing angry people to be abusive in an easy sort of cowardly way that doesn't cost them anything?
Yeah, so I don't have data about if part of it is the anonymity of the internet, right? We don't know who these people are who are sending these things. So I don't have the data on where this stuff is coming from, but I can tell you who is targeted. And with the members of Congress, we found that there was no effect. If you were a Republican or a Democrat, you were just as likely to be targeted. The only thing that affected whether you were going to be targeted was if you were a woman. And so I really do see it as, men attempting to put women into their places and say, down girl, if you're going to be engaging in this stuff, this is what's going to be happening to you just for raising your voice online, raising your voice in public, running for office, what have you. And the other thing that makes me think it's really about that objectification and denigration and punishment is the fact that most of these videos, They mostly live on sites that are dedicated to deepfake explicit material. So people know what they're looking at. It's not like they're being tricked. They know that they're looking at a deepfake, and they are relishing in that and enjoying the fact that they were able to have power over someone to create this content, which puts them at very best into a seemingly consensual encounter that is non-consensual, and at worst into something graphic and extremely violent. And yeah, right now there's just no recourse for most women. What I believe we need is that criminalization. And I was happy to see that the UK was starting to consider that as well under the auspices of the Online Safety Act.
Yeah. And out of interest, do you think in Germany obviously is in the EU, and one imagines that quite a lot of Musk's obsession with politics in the EU is around regulation, but clearly Britain, sadly, no longer in the EU. Do you think that that Online Safety Act, which you'll know is quite ambitious in its powers, do you think that's driving Musk and his, because he seems very, very focused on the UK at the moment?
So I think that is part of it. And I'm sure he looked at some of the reaction to the riots over the summer and saw overstepping. And, I think there were a couple cases where the police actually didn't do a great job of handling some of those cases. And some of those cases, I believe, were handled well. So I think that drew the ire of Musk because of that particular incident and the way that he, in my opinion, inflamed sentiments on the ground in the UK around that horribly tragic event. With Germany and the broader EU, I think this is much more political. And we've seen the DSA, the Digital Services Act, come up time and time again, including from people like J.D. Vance, the future vice president, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, the MAGA firebrand congresswoman, who see EU regulation as a threat to freedom of expression. And so what I imagine is happening is in these back-channel discussions between folks like Musk and Zuckerberg at Mar-a-Lago, as they're saying, Donald, we're really getting killed with these regulations in Europe. They're making it really expensive for us to operate. And then, they probably say something like, and they're restricting speech in a way that we feel is un-American. When, for the last 8 years, these companies have been asking to be regulated, literally begging to be regulated so that they at least had rules to operate by rather than just the court of public opinion. I hope I'm not wrong about this. I think these tech bros are in for a rude awakening because Europe loves regulation. They live for regulation. I think they're going to dig in their heels. And frankly, they see it as their job to fill in the gap that other democracies are leaving open, other democracies, namely the United States. So I'll be watching that with interest, but it's becoming, you don't expect to hear a congresswoman from Georgia talking about the Digital Services Act of the European Union as something that's a policy priority for the incoming administration. So it will be interesting to watch at the very least.
Well, it's time to take a break now. But after the break, stay with us because we'll be ordering the disorder.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
We have a segment on this podcast where we try to order the disorder, try to not only talk about what is quite a challenging environment, and rather than just say, well, Nina, give me your plan to fix it. I was going to ask, try to be a bit more specific that, are there case studies from around the world which might give us hope? And one which occurs to me, and I'd be very interested in your perception, is what happened in Brazil with X. And of course, Brazil, yes, it's a big country, it's an important country, but it's not necessarily a very powerful country in geopolitical terms. And yet it showed that perhaps not backing down can work. So perhaps, first off, for some of the listeners who don't perhaps know the story, you could describe that, and then maybe I'd just be interested in your reflections.
Yeah, Brazil was exactly the country that I was going to mention. And I actually just got back from Brazil for not a work trip, for tourism, and it was lovely. Highly recommend. But what we've seen in Brazil is that, they actually have some pretty strong internet regulations on the books. They are not often enforced very well.
Right.
But they have an internet bill of civil rights that's been on the books for quite a while. And then more recently, as disinformation became more of a problem in Brazil, the legislature introduced a set of regulations that require large platforms to have in-country representatives
Yeah.
and to comply with Brazilian law. And so after the Brazilian January 6th, which happened on January 8th.
This was Bolsonaro trying to do
Exactly.
a Trump, his own big lie, big steal, whatever you want to call it.
And you know, people were in the legislature and other government buildings in Brasilia. They've arrested a bunch of people. Bolsonaro is prohibited from running again. The Brazilian court system worked. They got very serious about that event.
Yeah.
And so when Musk refused to take down a post related to all of that, disinformation related to that insurrection, one Supreme Court justice in Brazil said, you know what, you are violating this law and you're also violating the law about having a local representative in Brazil. So we're going to block your platform until you comply. Musk tried to play this game of chicken and said, well, fine, block my platform. But I think what he saw hit his ego because Brazil actually has a lot of Twitter users. I don't know what the stat is off the top of my head, but usership went down. A lot of Brazilians migrated to platforms like Blue Sky. And eventually Musk balked. He said, all right, I'll comply with your law. I'll take down the post and I'll send a local representative to, represent X in Brazil. And so while Brazil is not perfect, and that's what I heard from a lot of Brazilians, but I can't think of another example, perhaps other than Julie Inman Grant, who we've already talked about in Australia, where regulators are actually standing up to these folks.
Yeah.
And it's important that they do that because, the metaphor that I use all the time is planes. We've got regulations on the airline industry. If a Boeing jet has a door that flies off in the middle of a flight, we ground those planes and we do an investigation until we figure out what's going on. And we have had so much harm caused by social media. And now all the bumpers on the bowling alley lanes are coming off in the United States. And it's up to folks like these regulators in other countries to stand up for the rest of us. And, we'll do our part here in the States too. But we're just trying to put out the fire.
One of the questions, obviously, how much can be done at a state level? I mean, particularly the really big states, and I'm thinking most obviously California with its, the tech industry is largely from there. Is there more that can be done in that context?
So a lot of people are working at that context, particularly with regard to things like non-consensual intimate imagery and deepfake pornography. A lot can be done for victims at the state level, and it's often much easier to get a bill passed in a state legislature than it is at the federal level because, in part, state legislatures are a little bit less polarized than our Congress is right now. And so I have been really interested to see the sorts of things that are coming out of California. I think they've got some really good tech regulation in the books. They've also got some bad stuff. Gavin Newsom very famously vetoed a bill on AI because he thought that the stipulations that it made of AI developers were going to stifle innovation and just be untenable. So at least you've got really considered policymaking happening in places like California, which they like to say has the 5th largest economy in the world. So
Indeed.
It does matter. But when you get to smaller states, I do worry about a patchwork of legislation happening where, you might cross a state line and the product that you get when you access a social media platform is different in Texas than it is in Oklahoma. And famously, Texas and Florida both tried to, in the name of anti-censorship, pass some very ill thought out legislation relating to how the social media platforms did content moderation. So I think we're going to see a lot of that continuing to happen. But again, I think this is a place where multilateral organizations like the EU, large democracies like the UK can really fill in the gaps. And I know there is work being done, particularly among the online safety regulators, to harmonize legislation across borders so that we don't have as much of that patchwork response.
Away from regulation, it feels as if with disinformation itself that there are real issues around people's ability to navigate online content, just literally to know that what they're looking at is a scam or is fake or whatever. It's often talked about, tech literacy and that sort of thing. Are you aware of cases where actually progress is being made? Or perhaps do you think maybe that the sort of younger generation, I mean, my kids are, very online, they're teenagers, maybe that they don't need the education and it's me and my parents' generation are the problem?
So I've done a lot of work on information literacy throughout my career because when I was in Ukraine, I started running into a program called Learn to Discern. They were doing this really innovative program where they were training librarians in Ukraine. And libraries in Ukraine are, like they are in the UK or the US, quite a important community pillar. It's kind of a vestige of the Soviet system, one of the only good things the Soviet system left behind. So they trained 10,000 librarians in information literacy techniques, send them back to their home cities and towns all around Ukraine. So this wasn't just in Kiev or Kharkiv or Lviv. It was everywhere.
Right.
And they trained another, I think, 100,000 people in these techniques. They also ran a concurrent information literacy kind of public information announcement on metros, on TV, et cetera, that said, information is a product, consume wisely. And they did pre and post testing that showed pretty impressive results, that people who had undergone the training or heard the announcement, the public service announcement, were less likely to be taken in by false information. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think this is a panacea. It has to be operating in coordination with regulation, in coordination with a robust public media ecosystem. But I do see increasingly people falling for things online that with just a little bit of know-how in the way the psychology of this stuff works, in the way the profit interests of the platforms work, that you wouldn't be taken in by it. And so I've been a huge proponent of it. I think the primary target audience needs to be older people, voting age adults. I do agree with you that like a lot of the younger students do not need this stuff because they are digital natives. But they get taken in other ways.
Yeah.
One thing that I've noticed with my graduate students at Syracuse University who are taking a class on disinformation, so they've got an interest in it, I have them track their information consumption for 24 hours.
Yeah.
And what I find is that they are all shocked at the degree to which their information consumption is passive. It is not active. They're not choosing to go to NewYorkTimes.com or seek out a specific creator on TikTok. It's being just given to them.
Yeah.
And I think trying to inspire in all consumers of information a little bit more active consumption is something that would benefit everybody. So that's what I think is perhaps if I had to say one thing that everybody should think about and try to kind of espouse, if you want to make a New Year's resolution about information consumption, would be try to be active about it.
So I guess my final question, which again on this sort of trying to think slightly more optimistically, is something I've noticed, particularly Facebook. A lot of people tell me, and I can see it from my own sort of experience, that Facebook is almost unusable now because it used to be the cute thing where your friend's daughter's graduated or whatever and you see the picture. And now those things are so deeply buried under bizarre.
Shrimp Jesus.
Right, and just endless AI nonsense, the sort of places that don't exist that I should go on holiday to. And it's just endless weird stuff that obviously, I mean, the effect it has on me that I spend a lot less time there is this gumming up of what used to be platforms for people to connect with other people who they knew or were getting to know. Is it going to kill itself off in a way? Because ultimately, they seem to be such unsatisfying resources these days.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know that Renee DiResta, who's another disinformation scholar, calls this the great decentralization. And she's saying that, the slow, to use another scholar's term, Cory Doctorow, the enshittification of social media.
Very good word.
Is forcing us to find alternatives. And sometimes those alternatives are smaller communities like Substack. There are alternative platforms like Blue Sky or Mastodon. But I think it's early days for all these platforms. And so the question is what will happen once they get acquired by a billionaire. And so just recently, a group of tech scholars and activists put together an effort called Free Our Feeds, where they're trying to raise $30 million, I think, to buy Blue Sky to make sure that it doesn't become another billionaire-owned platform. There are also, there are worries I have about people retreating into smaller spaces. We saw this a little bit with Facebook groups in, 2018 to 2022-ish, where that's the place where you see a lot of disinformation being spread and a lot of really targeted, nasty behavior happening. And you wonder if people are, even if you're in a group of like-minded people, it makes you more of a target. It makes you more vulnerable in some ways when somebody is able to kind of gain your trust there. It also means that we're more insular. And maybe that's a good thing, right? We all used to be insular just to our geographic neighborhoods before the internet came along. Maybe trying to focus on building that community is a good thing. And that's something that I'm thinking about a lot with the work that we're doing at the American Sunlight Project and how we reach people. Do we cut out the mainstream media in terms of, our amplification strategy? I think we're going to be experimenting with a lot of things. So I do see some hope there. And I'm hoping that the 2024 election result, particularly here in the United States, drives especially folks on the left to kind of put down their devices, go have conversations, touch grass, as Gen Z likes to say. And perhaps that is the silver lining of all of this.
Well, in these days, we need the silver linings that we can find. So it's good to hear that there are some. Nina, it's been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for helping us order the disorder and sharing your experiences, some of which, are ones that I can only say again, I'm very sorry you had to go through.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please tap follow to make sure you get every episode as soon as it launches. For more on the topics discussed, you can subscribe to our Substack. The link is in the show notes. The producer is George McDonough. The executive producer is Neil Fern. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have an orderly week.